we are going to try to get as many people's questions in as possible from 4 different locations here in Maine. So please try to make your question brief. Okay. And if you could tell us your name and what town you're from.
Yes, Louise Boatwright from Newport, Rhode Island. We have a lot of military as well. My question is, and you haven't really talked about it, but in Trump, with his nationalism, America first, it seems to me it was really a lot about jobs, and I think a couple of you talked about the education gap, I'm going to say, and the Rubik's Cube. And I think one of the Rubik's that hasn't been talked about, maybe more later, but I'd like you guys' opinion on this, is the automation. We've heard a lot that immigration, people look at immigration as the issue for taking jobs. And automation, many people have said it's automation. Okay. And it seems to me like climate change, we acted way too late, policy-wise. And I know this is foreign policy, but I still think that it all relates.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. All right, Jerry, as our resident economics expert here on the panel, I'm going to throw that one on automation to you. How much is that the problem?
I think it's a really important point, because the truth is that a lot of the economic anxiety about job loss is misattributed. A lot of it's attributed to immigration. It's not really immigration. It's much more automation, and globalization is also, you know, the boogeyman that people point to. But there's been probably more job loss to efficiency and automation than to either of those factors. That doesn't make it less painful for people, but it adds to the anxiety. I don't know what the policy's prescription is for that, except there's a very smart, an actual smart economic thinker, not me, in our bureau, Greg Ip, who's written very wisely about the fact that in the long run, automation actually increases employment. It actually affects, it grows the economy, that creates new opportunities, that creates new jobs. It adds to employment, it doesn't detract in the long run. But in the short run, people have to live their lives and they have to make ends meet, and it scares people. But I think it's a very wise question, and I do think there are public policy issues that have to be dealt with in that area.
Okay, good. And I just want to remind everyone to silence your phones. Evan, you wanted to add something.
I did. There's an important aspect of international politics related to automation, which is automation potentially is an accelerant of China's rise. The Chinese are investing enormously in automation in robotics in order for them to move up the value-added chain in manufacturing. They already use a lot of robotics in production of automobiles, and they're looking to get into other dimensions of the supply chain. So as China's population, working age population shrinks, I talked about the demographic challenges, automation is actually one of those ways in which the Chinese can compensate for the shrinking working age population, while at the same time moving up the value-added production chain. You know, we all know about China as the producer of textile, apparels, and footwear. But that's China of 15 years ago. Manufacturing in China is now new energy vehicles, right? Of course, it's solar panels. The Chinese are trying to move into semiconductors. Automation is going to be critical to that. But here's the other piece. The Chinese are not only using automation and robotics for manufacturing, they want to become the global leader in producing robotics as well. So if they pull that hat trick off, then I think the rest of us have a real challenge in front of us.
Okay, good. Do we have a question up in the balcony there? Go ahead, please, and remember to make it end with a question.
My name is Olivia Bradstreet, and I'm a student from UMaine in Orono. How do we reach the divide between the educated and the undereducated without fueling the idea that there is this, invisible hand of the elites?
Thank you, Olivia. Matt, can I throw that question to you? Yeah. Good question. Can I throw that student's question to you, because you were talking so much about that values divide between the higher educated and the lower educated, particularly across Europe?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. The democracy originally was all about being a marketplace of ideas and having different views and opinions brought together, like all of us in this room. And what's clear is that large numbers of voters from particular social groups no longer feel as though they're part of that conversation. And that partly is about descriptive representation. So if you look 1 month before the referendum in Britain, 50% of workers said, people like me have no say in government. Now that's happened alongside the fact that our political class, you might call it, has become more highly educated, more middle class, more affluent, more removed from the everyday experiences of those voters. Even Labour MPs have become more middle class progressively over the last 20, 30 years. One thing I'd like to see is a much greater focus on improving descriptive representation for underrepresented groups. So when they look at politicians, decision makers, folks in the corridors of power, they actually begin to see people a little bit more like them reflected back. Now that's difficult for those within the corridors of power to actually think about and accept because it challenges a whole host of things. It can be done, for example, through deliberative democracy, through citizens' assemblies, through things that have been going on partly in France. One of the problems there is you find that the only people who participate tend to be highly educated, middle class, high income voters. But to me, that's where we need to look, which is how can we make politics more representative? Because unless we start making those voters feel as though they are at the table and they are in that conversation, all of these policy decisions, it's easy to talk about international policies and you know, what President X is doing, what President Y is doing. We're going to have these rebellions running over and over and over again because, hey, we live in mass democracy, right? And that's great. But we have to work on descriptive representation.
Steve.
Just two points. These two questions actually dovetailed nicely, because what makes automation and issues like that so destabilizing is the fact that in the short term they have enormous consequences for particular industries. In the long run, the solution to that, of course, is re-education for having people who can adapt from career to career as technology changes. And similarly, what promotes the civic virtues that allow a democracy to flourish is a certain level of education that then allows people to participate more effectively in the political process. So you can't have these things going on simultaneously while your public education system is getting worse and worse and worse. These both go together.
All right, that's your job, Olivia. Fix the public education system. All right, we have another question here.
Jody Gill, Boston. What has been the role of the legacy media in the rise of populism, both here and in Europe?
I guess that's for me. Well, Jerry and I guess we can sort of talk about that. Why don't you start out?
Well, look, I think a lot about 2016, right? And what various institutions failed in many ways. We failed by not seeing Trump and Sanders coming. I mean, let's be honest, we missed it. You know, nobody took Bernie Sanders seriously. Nobody believed you could actually finance a national campaign run by a socialist, 7-year-old socialist with contributions of $200 or less, and he did it, right? None of us took Trump seriously as a potential Republican nominee or elected presidential candidate until it had already happened. So then you ask yourself, why did we miss that, right? Well, I think that what the legacy media did was fail to listen to people more. I mean, we talk to ourselves too much. We don't listen to people enough. And I think that we hopefully have learned a lesson, and it's to get out of the bubble, the kind of bubble you and I know about in Washington, where we spend a lot of time talking to each other and talking to people like you, and not enough to people like you.
But never leaking.
Well, except for you. You didn't leak, yeah. And I think that, did we contribute to it? Yeah, I think we probably contributed to it by not listening. The same way you were talking, Steve, about politicians not listening. I think we didn't listen to people, and so therefore we were surprised. And so therefore people in the Trump revolution and the Bernie Sanders revolution have relatively little use for people like me in some cases because we didn't listen to them before. Why should they believe we're going to listen to them now? So that's what I think we did wrong, and that's how I think we contributed to the phenomenon of 2016.
I have something to add to that because my other hat from being a Boston Globe columnist is I'm the chair in journalism ethics at the Poynter Institute, which is the leading journalism think tank and training institute for professional journalists in the US, which is down in St. Petersburg, Florida. And the project that I've sort of taken on post 2016 is, you're absolutely right, Jerry. The legacy media, we were all talking to ourselves in Washington. Although people were going out in the field and doing lots of interviews. My husband is a photojournalist, and he was telling me for months, Trump is going to win. Trump is going to win. He was out of these rallies. I said, no, he's not. Aren't you reading the polls? Aren't you reading Nate Silver? He's like, no, actually, Nira, Trump is going to win. And he was right, and everybody who was actually out there at those rallies knew about the enthusiasm gap. But I think there's also partly a larger problem here, which has been the erosion of trust in media over the last several decades, and it's part of the erosion of trust in institutions. So the erosion of trust in the presidency, in Congress, in the media, in all of our institutions is partly what brought us here to where we are today. And part of what I'm trying to do is work on restoring and rebuilding trust, and it's a much longer issue than we can talk about right here, but it began, I would say, with the deregulation under Reagan of the sort of FCC and the end of the Fairness Doctrine, which enabled the rise of Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, right-wing talk radio, whose entire message was, don't believe them, don't believe legacy media, they're not telling you the truth, believe us. And decades of erosion in trust in media have allowed Trump to say fake news, the media is all fake news, don't listen to them, only trust me. So it is a much larger problem, and I think to solve it, to get people to the voting booth, it's also about getting people connected, getting media connected to people, getting people to trust the media again.
Can I come in there?
Yes,
briefly?
please.
Because the one thing that I've noticed, at least in Europe, in terms of the media debate, is we can point to 1980s and things that Reagan did and so on, but there's been no serious reflection within much of the British or European media about what's happening. The natural response to the Brexit vote was to have a serious debate about why coastal communities and northern communities have been consistently cut adrift by a settlement that has been focused on London. We didn't have that debate. Another response would have been to say, how come there are almost no working class politicians anymore in British politics? We didn't have that debate. We had the debate about what the city wants, what financial services want, what London wants. And I think the media has to try and get some of these discussions and get these debates into the arena.
I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, listen to everybody more, and I know that media is trying to do that now. All right, I want to encourage the folks in Portland and Rockland and Belfast to also get their view in. And I see we have one here from Timothy Farrelly in Belfast who says, how do Europe's political transitions fuel independence movements in Catalonia and Scotland? All right. Who would like to take that one? That's very specific. Matt, I know you're looking you're looking all across Europe. We saw it from your detailed graphics. So maybe you'll know something about this.
Well, briefly, so on Scotland, there is no mass enthusiasm for a second vote. There is no mass support for independence. And in Catalonia, both of those show how what you might loosely call the elite have badly managed separatist crises. And I think the deeper question that is reflected in that word transition is, can the European Union actually become an arbiter of these very local, very regional, very real conflicts within this European tent? Catalonia and Scotland are just two, but you can talk about Corsica, northern Italy, you can talk about Central and East European minorities. So many folks have kind of put a large bet that Europe is going to be able to accommodate all of these differences and bridge compromise over the longer term. But there is a very different view, which is that Europe is simply too different. There are too many regionalist, nationalist concerns to put this into one block. And I know Americans are desperate. Some Americans are desperate for Europe to work for obvious reasons. It's a key ally. It's a massive market. But the tensions underlying Europe are political. They're national, they're regional. And as we'll discover in Italy, as we'll discover in Hungary this year, where there's a massive election, in Sweden, where there's another election, Europe, these divides are very, very strong, very deep. So I think for America, big question here is, maybe throw it out to you guys, because you're more of an expert on this than me, but it's how much can America now rely on the European Union?
Steve.
Just very quickly, 2 points. What this question reminds us is that nationalism remains an extraordinarily powerful political force. right? And the European Union was at least partly intended long-term to try and transcend nationalism, tame it in a variety of ways. I think what we've learned over the last 10 or 15 years is that in all of these countries, nationalism and national identity of various kinds is very deep. It's not going anywhere. It's one of these realities we're going to have to simply accommodate and live with. Secondly, there's this great paradox, right, between Europe, the European Union and movements like Catalonian independence. If you have a European Union that's actually functioning, you don't necessarily need to be part of Spain. As long as Catalonia could remain within the European Union, it can still have all the benefits of the economic interchange that exists within the European Union and have its own little cultural autonomy. So paradoxically, the success of the European Union has also, in some respects, fueled the reemergence of national sentiments in a variety of different places.
All right. There's someone who's been waiting patiently in the back here. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Sally Smith. I'm from Boothbay. To what degree do you attribute, the persistence of our goal of global hegemony, even unto Trump? And is it our worshipful attitude toward guns and weapons and our economic dependence on the creation of them?
All right. Global hegemony. Steve, why don't you start that first? Glass half empty or half full with global hegemony?
What a silly phrase. Who would ever say something like that? I mean, I think there's several things going on here. One is the historical legacy of the Cold War, where the United States really for the first time took on global responsibilities on a semi-permanent or at least open-ended basis, and then proceeded to create a set of global institutions and a set of military commitments all over the world. And in that process, of course, began to create a set of institutions, including the development of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, including the entire array of think tanks, including schools like where I teach, like the John F. Kennedy School and Johns Hopkins SAIS and a whole series of others. Well, once you get to the end of the Cold War and that mission has been accomplished, those institutions are not going to simply go out of business. Right? And in fact, they immediately began looking for new missions, new things to do. And getting back to debates we haven't had, we never really had a debate in the United States in the early 1990s over what the American role in the world ought to be post-Cold War. I agree completely with Jerry. There was no powerful sentiment for genuine isolationism, for disengaging either economically or politically, diplomatically, or even completely militarily. But whether or not the United States needed to maintain that enormous global footprint that we had, whether we needed to calibrate it in various ways, or whether we should do what we did, which was to try and extend it even further, including into a variety of places where the ground was not particularly fertile for what we were trying to do. That conversation was done essentially on an ad hoc basis in response to events, and I think in large part because we had a large establishment that really liked being busy and had convinced itself that this mission was going to be easy to do. I don't think that's actually connected in any particular way to our domestic fondness for firearms, at least in some segments of the population. And I don't think it's actually driven by the sort of desire just to, the arms industry and sell weapons and things like that. I actually, the military-industrial complex, although it has a lot of political influence, is a declining share of the American economy, right? And our overall economy might actually do better if it declined a little bit more.
All right, so Steve has given us quite an indictment of the foreign policy blob, as it was referred to in Washington in a notorious article that sort of condemned all of us who were thinking about foreign policy in Washington. Evan, you were a card-carrying member of the foreign policy blob. What's your reaction to the global hegemony thing? Is it all the fault of the think tanks and the NSC people who are trying to control the world?
Sure. I mean,
Sure.
So...
Okay, let's just stop there.
Yeah. Good answer.
Well said. She set me up, Steve. I have to say, it is interesting that we have a Harvard professor that's on the board of all the blob magazines that's not part of the blob. So we could
he's part of the blob.
I'm a participant observer in this anthropology.
Got it. So I think Steve gave a very, very articulate explanation that I would put in the basket of bureaucratic politics. It's a bunch of people and institutions that just want to keep the gravy train going. That's one theory. I look at it from the perspective of Asia. And when I look at Asia, it's 60% of global growth, 60% of global growth, 40% of global output. If America is not engaged in Asia, if it's not shaping economic affairs, security affairs, then American interests are undermined. It's not about making sure Evan Medeiros has a job at a think tank. It's about making sure that the millions of Americans who benefit from cheap goods in Asia, the millions of Americans that get jobs attached to investment and trade with the Asia Pacific continue to have those opportunities because it's the fastest growing part of the world. Oh, and by the way, there are huge threats to American security interests. And I'm not just talking about our allies, because we could debate about whether or not those allies, that's the right allocation of resources. I'm talking about threats to the American homeland. So that's the North Korean nuclear weapon program, the fact that American security commitments probably have prevented Japan, South Korea, and from Taiwan from developing their own nuclear weapons and sparking another major power war. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of my presentation, the rise of China. If America is not engaged in the Asia Pacific, it will undermine all of our economic and security interests. It's not just about institutions and bureaucracies and people.
I would add one other element that is worth thinking about in response to your question. It's simply 9/11. Think about 9/11. So I remember when George W. Bush, not H.W. Bush, but the second President Bush came to office. He came to office saying essentially, the Cold War's over. We're going to not do this nation building thing anymore. You referred to this last night, Steve. We're done with that. We don't need to do that anymore. The 9/11 terror strikes occur. People look up and say, well, are we going to fight ISIS here, or are we going to fight them over there? Next thing you know, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, and we're engaged in nation building again. That's not hegemony. That is basically attempting to deal with threats to the U.S. from someplace other than on U.S. soil. Now you're seeing a similar debate when it comes to North Korea. Shouldn't we stop the North Korean nuclear program there before it reaches us here? Now, I don't know the right answer to that question. I'm just saying these are not impulses that are born of some desire for global hegemony. They're born out of fear of legitimate threats out there, and I think that some of what you've seen in the last decade is a response to a fear that was certainly, if not born on, was certainly rapidly accelerated on 9/11.
Good point, Jerry. All right, we have a question up here in the audience, and again, I want to remind people in Portland, Rockland, and Belfast that you can write down your questions and send them in.
Good morning. My name is Jenna Sanders. I'm a student at the University of Maine at Farmington. We've spoken some this morning about encouraging political involvement, rebuilding media trust, and the rising levels of distrust in public officials and prevailing government institutions. It is my opinion that these feelings are especially present in the millennial generation, who feel disenfranchised in today's polarized political climate and therefore failed to mobilize. Given the importance of civic engagement in a well-functioning democracy, how do you suggest we rebuild this trust and promote involvement, particularly in the younger generations?
Thank you. Great question. Matthew, I'm going to throw this to you because you did raise this question of sort of saying that we're at the beginning, not the sort of tail end of this populist rise. But I want to understand why that's true. If millennials have a different set of values and don't feel the same way as the Brexiteers and the Trumpers, then why will that not necessarily age out? And what can be done to encourage sort of buy-in and engagement from millennials so they don't just feel completely alienated from political culture?
So I think it's important we don't view millennials as a homogenous block. There are big differences within them. I think if you look at millennials in France and Germany without a degree that have left school at 16 and found actually reality in the Eurozone economy where youth unemployment rates are 20-30%, life's not easy. Life's not comfortable. We now have Gen Xers in Britain who are 30s, 40s living with mum and dad, still unable to get the 100K deposit that you need for a house in London. So there is a new left behind among parts of the millennials and parts of Gen Xers that are feeling the same populist sentiment. It's less about immigration, but it is more about relative deprivation. I'm not getting as much as they're getting. and I'm certainly not getting anywhere near as much as baby boomers are getting. And that's really important. I think millennials have not participated to the extent that they should be doing. These are massive battles over your future. But if you take Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who's exciting millennials, right? My university is in Canterbury. And for the first time since the era of William Gladstone in the 1800s, student mobilization turned Canterbury from Conservative to Labour. And it was called the famous Youthquake. But what people didn't point out was that even then, millennial turnout was 20 points below pensioners. Right? That there was still a 20-point gap between them. And you saw that in your own election. So I think millennials have got to try and mobilize. Why aren't they mobilizing to a greater degree? I think Clinton really didn't give them a very inspiring message. He didn't give them a meaningful motive for turning out. I think there was an element of complacency. But they also, I think, have felt that the political conversation, in the same way that blue-collar workers feel the conversation is not involving them, I think there is a sense that intergenerational fairness is going to become increasingly dominant in the West. It's going to be very, very hard to keep millennials engaged in the mainstream and get them turning out if they feel that the current political and economic settlement isn't working for them. And this is where I like to bash liberals. I think you can get that from the way that I talk and present. But I think I look at the Remain camp and I look at the Democrats and I see exactly the same problem, which is there is no instrumental case for. It is all anti. It's all against. It's against Trump. It's against Brexit. They've got to gee up that message and come up with something that is far more inspiring.
Steve, you, other than Matthew, you also talk to millennials for a living. That's what you do. You engage with them all the time, every day. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, I deal with a very self-selected group of millennials, namely students at the Kennedy School who are already self-selected. They are idealistic, they're passionate, they're energetic. They are not the problem, or they may be a problem in a different way, but they're not the problem in terms of lack of participation. But to answer the woman's question, the other suggestion I would make to millennials and really to everybody is that when it looks like politics is broken at the national level, and it is, and it feels like you can't really affect anything, don't be distracted by the fact that social media and all forms of media focus enormous attention on Washington. There is an enormous amount you can do at the state and local level. And the nice thing about involvement in state and local politics is a small number of people who get organized and have passion can actually change something. They can change something in their local school district, in their local congressional district. I say this as someone whose wife is now running for state representative back in Massachusetts. There are lots of young people working on her campaign. They are absolutely terrific. I think globally, she acts locally, and that's not a bad combination. So, and one final point is, by doing that, by starting out working in local politics, you learn all of those retail skills that become incredibly valuable in the rest of the political process. So that's the apprenticeship.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. Sherry, I want to bring you in because you wrote about this in the aftermath of the election in Virginia, where there was millennial turnout, and they were part of what made the difference in that vote.
Absolutely. So I'll say two things. First is I'll put a plug in for my son, who's a millennial, who's starting an organization in Boston called Organize Together, which is designed specifically to create an app that makes it easier for activists to find each other and find organizations and causes they're enthused about. And it's a startup company, and it is specifically designed to get people involved at the grassroots and make it easier for them to get involved at the grassroots. That's point A. Point B, on the Virginia election. So if 2016 happened, 2017 next year, there's a big election for governor of Virginia. There was an interesting group called Next Gen America. It's funded by Tom Steyer. And they set out to mobilize millennials in the Virginia governor's election. And they specifically looked at 9 precincts in Virginia where there was a majority millennial population, largely precincts around college campuses. And they set out to get people to vote in the Virginia governor's election. And sure enough, in those 9 precincts, in every one, turnout among millennials was up substantially from 4 years ago. In one near Virginia Commonwealth University, it was double the turnout among millennials versus 4 years earlier. So I think there are signs that the apathy that was there, I think to some extent, in 2016 has been wiped out by 2016 among millennials, and that they're out mobilizing and activating. And I hope that's the case.
Thank you. All right, do we have a question here, number 2?
Yes, I'm Michael Roberts, Andover, Massachusetts. So this is another voting turnout electorate question. There are at least a few countries in which it's an obligation, not an option, to vote in the national election. Everybody must vote. Do you think that there's any political will on either side of the aisle to change the Constitution to oblige people to vote? And furthermore, if that were accomplished, what do you in which way would things go politically? Thank you.
Interesting question. I don't ever see that happening in America, but maybe I'm wrong. Evan, you've actually worked in the White House. What are your thoughts?
No idea.
No idea.
I'd come in briefly on this. I don't know if you want every non-voter turning out. And the reason I say that is there's a great book, 2012, a nice book called Class Politics and the Radical Right, and Hans-Peter Creasy, who's at the EUI in Florence, he did an analysis of non-voters. And this was 4 years before Brexit, and he found that 63% of the British non-voters were what he called instinctively receptive to the populist message, right? And that was 4 years before Brexit. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, we saw that big revolt was because non-voters are starting to come back into the party system. And this is going to have really big consequences. The AfD in Germany, for example, wholly dependent almost on, well, the main source were about 1 million non-voters, people that didn't bother to turn out at the last election, but then they said, you know what, now there's something for me. There's a vehicle for me. Now the politics, I'm sure, we'd all say the politics are not our politics, but this is now going to have a longer term, more durable effect on party systems. The mainstream has to now have a conversation with those voters and try and figure out a way of winning them back. And that's going to be really difficult when most social democrats I talk to in Europe are not seriously interested in talking about immigration, in talking about the refugee crisis, in talking about security, in talking about identity. It's very comfortable for social democrats, progressive liberals to say, oh, this is all about economic scarcity. Much more difficult for them to put themselves outside of that comfort zone and say, hang on, what if these identity concerns aren't just about being unemployed or having a rubbish job? What if it's actually about a value conflict that's kicking off? And unless they get to grips with that, as I showed you with the chart, they will continue to suffer big electoral losses.
Right, and the acceptance of that cultural identity, politics aspect of it, I think is crucial. I think we have a question from one of our remote locations, and it's Tim R. in Portland, who says, what role will the UN play in addressing global concerns? Evan, let me go to you first on this.
Modest. I see the UN's role as consistently modest. The UN can help highlight issues in episodic ways, like with Iran or North Korea. Sometimes the UN Security Council can take actions on North Korea in particular. There's been a successive number of UN Security Council resolutions that have imposed sanctions on North Korea that I think are really biting. But because the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, Russia, China, France, and Britain, all have veto power, Russia and China can effectively block progress, and that's consistently happened on issues like Syria. So I think the UN can help highlight issues, can help set the agenda, but I think there's very little we can rely on it for practical action.
And yet, had it not been for the cooperation for Russia and China, we would not have gotten an Iran nuclear deal. And if anything, the obstacle now to the continuation of that deal potentially is not Russia or China, but potentially us, if we were to pull out of it.
And imagine if you're North Korea, right? The Trump administration they have a very ambivalent / sclerotic / disorganized view on diplomacy with North Korea. So they look at Iran and see Trump really wanting to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, but at the same time, maybe Trump wants to negotiate with North Korea. I mean, you can see how the two messages would undercut one another.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I mean, I'm a realist, so I don't place enormous weight in the UN, but the existence of independent agencies like the International Atomic Energy Agency to provide verification of an arms control agreement with Iran, or if we ever got an agreement with North Korea, is actually of independent value, because you don't want to just have to believe what the American intelligence services say or what the Chinese intelligence services say or the Russian intelligence services. You would like to have a reasonably objective international agency to go in and say they're abiding by the agreement or they're not abiding by the agreement, because that has greater international legitimacy and credibility. So there's an independent function that the United Nations can perform that no national government can do in quite the same way.
So I know that a lot of you have questions, and we have time only now for one last question. So I would encourage you all to please hold on to those questions. Come back in the afternoon. You will get another shot at asking these. And let me go to this lady here, if you could, or this person here, if you could ask your question briefly.
Peter Schieferdecker from Greenwich, Connecticut. A question from Mr. Medeiros. All the projections and political estimates in China seem to expect continued stability within this Chinese government and its activities. Wouldn't it be reasonable to expect some kind of a revolution or perhaps political upheaval within China?
So thanks for the easy question. China's political future is sort of the 64,000 renminbi question, because the theory had always been, as the Chinese middle class grows, expectations will rise. They'll want more than just economic and social benefits. They'll now want political and civil liberties. Or that's how the theory goes. And if you look at the evolution of other Asian countries, Taiwan, South Korea, from one-party system, authoritarian countries to democracies, there's sort of a developmental level above which political demands for political participation grow. China has disproven a lot of that. The middle class in China, depending on how you estimate it, but if you use the World Bank estimates, the middle class is probably about 300 million in China and growing. That's about the size of the American population. And so these questions are not being asked. Now, that said, political life, social life in China is more open than it was 20 years ago. You don't have to ask your boss if you can get married, for example. So there is much more private space for debate and discussion about sensitive political issues. So this characterization of sort of China is a living hell politically is wrong. But nonetheless, Xi Jinping has systematically started cracking down on civil liberties. I mean, lawyers, human rights activists, journalists. I mean, the space for all of them to operate is significantly constrained as Xi Jinping expands the role of the party. And he's now pushing it into the operations of Chinese companies, private companies, to Western multinationals, joint ventures. So I see the role of the party expanding and not contracting. And I find that very, very worrisome. But there's no sign of widespread national level unrest in China that would suggest that China's on the brink of social or political revolution. It's the opposite. I mean, of course, there's substantial sources of social and political discontent, environmental pollution and environmental destruction, anti-corruption, there are a whole variety of them. But the local officials seem to be pretty good at using a mix of incentives and coercion to buy them off. And the fact that China has the most extensive internal security apparatus, some 600,000 troops, and it has proven to be exceptionally effective at using technology, monitoring social media, the regular media, and manipulating it as a way to nip any serious dissent in the bud and certainly prevent it from spreading, suggests that I think the Communist Party is, very, very firmly in control. The question becomes, at what point does China reach a level of economic development where people actually start asking these questions. Expectations keep rising sufficiently. Maybe it's a generational thing. I mean, political scientists and sociologists of China disagree, but there's no evident signs of that kind of instability. And the fact that the Chinese economy continues to grow, the Chinese government continues to provide jobs, improve standards of living, you have Chinese traveling all throughout the world now, suggests that that middle class is quite content.